Welcome to the Byron, Shelley, and Keats flipped lesson. This is an analysis and sort of presentation on these three revolutionary British Romantic poets, and it details sort of their contributions to the changes that we see in British Romantic poetry. I even did you a huge favor and threw an analysis of a Byron poem in just to sweeten the deal. So, move forward, enjoy, and make sure you take notes. Probably one of the most significant of the six British Romantics is George Gordon, Lord Byron. So I think this piece of the puzzle of the video is tremendously significant because of the role that Lord Byron played in the Romantic movement. So my notes over here say he's the most flamboyant and notorious of the major English Romantic poets. George Gordon, or Lord Byron, was likewise the most fashionable poet of the early 1800s. So we have a ton of work that we can use for the work of Lord Byron. Some of the works are large and beyond the scope of what we can do in a high school class, even here at U of D. But again, it's going to be something that we can talk about later on. Probably most significant about our understanding of Lord Byron is that he created the immensely popular romantic hero. Now, we've defined this, we've called it this probably last year when you were a sophomore, but certainly this year is this idea is Lord Byron coined the term Byronic hero. Byronic, B-Y-R-O-N-I-C, a Byronic hero. Characteristics are he's defiant, he's melancholy, he's haunted by secret guilt. Three huge characteristics that I think define where British Romantic poetry goes. Really, not even just poetry, but literature in general, and defining its archetypes and defining its main characters, probably for at least another 100 years. So I think that's hugely significant. Even though it's not as immensely popular now as it was several years ago, if you look at the entire Twilight series, the novel, and then probably more the novel, but then what Hollywood did with the films, is the character of Edward is that dark, brooding, melancholic character that all of a sudden seems to grab people's attention. Byron is even described as quote-unquote sexy as a character, and he had a look that he could give a woman and she would fall madly and deeply in love with him. So certainly Byron and his lovers, Byron and his melancholic nature had a huge impact on sort of where this character type goes in the development of literature. Again, defiant, melancholy, haunted by some sort of secret guilt. His characters require a tremendous amount of background development to get at what that secret guilt might be. So that's significant for the notes. Byron is also a romantic paradox. Again, P-A-R-A-D-O-X. A paradox in the fact that he's the leader of the era's poetic revolution. He named Alexander Pope, who's a metaphysical poet, as his master, a worshiper of the ideal. He never lost touch with reality. So he is a worshiper of the ideal. So Byron's poetry seeks the ideal character, the ideal circumstance. So I think that's relevant in our notes. He seeks the ideal. He never lost touch with reality. I found this interesting, so I included it in my notes. He's a deist and a free thinker. He retained from his youth a Calvinist sense of original sin. So he's got this idea about sin and guilt woven into his thought process. He championed liberty in his works and deeds, giving money, time, energy, and ultimately his life to the revolution in Greece. The war for independence in Greece costs Lord Byron his life ultimately. In my notes, I wrote, so he practices what he preaches. His many-faceted personality found expression in satire, ode, lyric poetry, drama, historic tragedy, dramatic monologue, serio-comic epic, and many, many letters. Here's what you want to take out of that. His personality, his inspiration found expression in satire, in ode, in lyric, and he is absolutely focused on a sense of tragedy. Now, I'm over my 5-minute mark for where I wanted each of these authors to be, but I found this to be interesting. Lord Byron is an archetype for Dracula, for Bram Stoker's Dracula. So certainly there's a lot of things going on in Shelley's life that certainly connects with the idea of Dracula. Even these notes reference the movie Twilight as a major development of the character. Also talks about Nosferatu. But again, certainly some things that I think are very, very interesting. So this is your little segment on Byron, and you should be using this as a second piece of notes that you take from this video so that you are in good note shape for moving forward. Just because I'm picky, I want to make sure that we again have the characteristics of Romanticism in our notes. This also should impress upon you the need to go through and have these written down, be able to reproduce them on quizzes. So again, number one, the emphasis on emotional and imaginative spontaneity. So the power of emotion and imagination and how it inspires the individual. Number two, the importance of self-expression and individual feeling. So by now, we should have figured out that these authors are all about self-expression, how they see a particular moment, that sensuous nuance that we talked about way long time ago with Wordsworth and Coleridge. So that self-expression and the idea of individual feeling. Number three, we have a religious response to nature. Now, it may not be true for all your authors, but certainly a religious response to nature is going to be something of value to us. The fourth characteristic, a capacity for wonder. Again, a capacity for wonder and consequently a reverence for the freshness and innocence of the vision of childhood. That kind of wove two things in together there. So a capacity for wonder and a reverence for the freshness and innocence that is the vision of childhood. So childhood innocence over educated sophistication. Sort of three different ways to say the same thing. We have the emphasis on the imagination as a positive and creative faculty. That our response to the world around us comes through our ability to use our imagination. I have my next characteristic is an interest in the primitive forms of art. For instance, in the work of early poets, in ancient ballads and folk songs, some of the romantics turned back to past times to find inspiration. I know I talked about, or will talk about later, the idea of this medieval influence and how it's a clash. We can address all of that later. So this idea about interest in primitive forms of art, probably not your most significant characteristic, but it may be of value to you overall. This last characteristic is a new one. It says it's an interest in and concern for the outcasts of society. That those subjects that these poems address are not your upper echelon. They're going to be characters that are removed, that live life on the fringe, that often struggle. So an interest in and concern for the outcasts of society, the tramps, the beggars, the obsessively emotional characters, and the poor and disregarded are especially the subject matter in the poetry of the Romantics. So I think really significant there. So to recap, we have emotional and imaginative spontaneity. We have the importance of self-expression and individual feeling. We have an almost religious response to nature. We have a capacity for wonder and a reverence for the vision of childhood. We talk about the imagination as a positive and creative faculty. And ultimately, the subject matter of the poetry deals with the outcast, those that are isolated and separated from mainstream. I like them because they feel things more intensely than do those who are connected, prepared for, taken care of by society. So this segment is designed just to, again, flesh out your characteristics so that you can use them more intelligently as you get to quizzes this week, primarily Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then moving forward to the final test at the end and then the final. So hopefully you can attend this and put it into your notes. One of those things that we know about Lord Byron is the fact that he was married to the macabre. And this is probably why I'm recording this in the dark, plus I find it amusing. So the macabre, M-A-C-A-B-R-E, this is the scary, this is the supernatural, this is the strangely odd set of things that consume these authors. So I find this significant. So we know that Byron's Gothic flamboyance perpetuated his sense of the spooky. So he tries to capture these particular things as he goes through and writes his poetry. It's just interesting stuff we know about him. A coffin stood at one end of his dining room, which he had turned into an indoor shooting gallery. So if the shooting gallery wasn't odd enough, the fact that he has a coffin that he keeps in there. I don't know if there was anybody in it, but certainly an interesting idea. We know that Byron collected the skulls of the monks that had been buried at the abbey where he hung out. And we know that Byron's own ancestors from the family crypt, their skulls were used as flower pots that lined the walls of his office. So he kept the skulls and the ideas, he kept the skulls of his dead family members and used them as flower pots. Famously, we know that he had a drinking mug made from the skull of one of the monks. So I find that to be incredibly interesting as we go through and look at these concepts. Now, more specifically, and I'm going to reach over here and turn the other light on because it looks a little bit foggy. There we go. So Byron and his friends wore long, dark robes, kind of monkish, but more like of a cult of personality, if you will, as worn by medieval monks for their gatherings. When Percy Shelley was cremated, Byron wanted his skull so he could use it for either a flower pot or for a drinking mug, but he was clearly told that he couldn't because, well, think about it. Everybody knew at that point how weird he was, so they stopped humoring him. Now that we've had an opportunity to create context for George Gordon, Lord Byron, here is an analysis of one of his most famous poems, She Walks in Beauty Like the Night. My plan here is to use this as an analysis of the poem as opposed to covering it in class. So make sure you review this and write the notes down so you have everything that you need. So here's the final piece of this little inserted segment in your presentation on the three revolutionary poets. So this is about Lord Byron. So what we're doing here is we're talking about his famous poem, She Walks in Beauty Like the Night. So the title of the poem is She Walks in Beauty Like the Night. It's in your anthology. and certainly going to give us some good context. What I'm going to do here is walk through the general themes and ideas so that you'll have it nice and clear for as we approach the end of this particular unit. So she walks in beauty. We know that Byron uses a tremendous amount of imagery to describe the woman with dark hair in this poem. So when he says she walks in beauty like the night, of course, this is a simile, and Byron is comparing the woman to the night, a very clear use of imagery. Now we know that the night is usually a symbol of darkness, and we certainly have gone over this entire year. Sometimes darkness, sometimes a symbol of death. He takes that and he juxtaposes it into something beautiful. So I just revealed that he's talking about her hair in the comparison, but we've been so trained to think about this in regards to it's about her hair. I'm sorry, it's about death, it's about darkness. It's an interesting comparison of ideas. He uses alliteration to call attention to the light versus dark images. He talks about the cloudless climes, the starry skies, the day denies and serenely sweet. And he compares those four specific sets of images to her beauty. So again, it gives me a really nice metaphorical way of looking at how he's comparing this woman with dark hair to something beautiful, very romantic like the night. Other things that we notice as we go through the poem is he talks about the tender light, something that you feel. So the light that he's discussing, he makes it a physically felt idea. I noticed that in a couple of your character sketches where you talk about how your authors are using feeling sensations to grab the reader's attention. Again, I think that's very significant in the way that we look at things. So when you have tender light, we have a feeling, a touching sense tied into one of vision. So we're taking two senses and we're combining those together in the poem. Later on, it says, which heavy to gaudy day denies. It's personification. Again, our literary devices. Heaven can't deny anything because it's not a physical idea and the day can't be gaudy. This may seem somewhat pedantic and overly simplified, but it should make some sense as we're going into the poem and jogging your memory. It is a poem of polarities. You could use the word dichotomy, you could say opposites, but it's a poem of polarities, comparing the light and the dark. Again, dark and bright, cloudless climes and starry skies. Certainly, I think something that is of value. As we move into the next stanza, it talks about one shade the more, one ray the less. She's so perfect as she is that one shade more, one more bit of darkness, or one more piece of light would ruin the particular image. These cancel each other out and really suggest that there's a balance to the dark and light. Everything is perfectly modeled here in the poem. Again, I think really what we've been looking for all term is that kind of an idea. It goes on, it gives me the image of the raven tress or the black hair, specifically what that's talking about. It's a metaphor. So we've got personification, we've got simile, we've got juxtaposition. The raven tress is a metaphor. It's unusual because at the time, pale blondes were the standard of beauty. I find that interesting that the blonde-haired bombshell seems to be the stereotypical standard of beauty even in the 21st century. So that's a challenging idea in the context of what he's doing in She Walks in Beauty Like the Night. I was going to say she wanders lonely as a cloud, but that's Wordsworth. So that wouldn't go so hot here. So I think that standard of beauty makes a tremendous amount of sense. Byron even goes on later to say that that beauty makes her face, or that darkness even makes her face even more beautiful. So as you have this poem in front of you as we're going through this would give you a tremendous look at what's going on in the poem. Again, as we start looking at the end analysis after the turn in the poem, her outside beauty is a reflection of the internal beauty. Again, juxtaposing the outside imagery with the internal kind of meaning and the application of those concepts. So it says, where thoughts serenely sweet express, how pure, how dear their dwelling place. This personifies thoughts. They don't speak, they use a metaphor for her mind. Let me rephrase that. So these ideas, the beauty, it doesn't speak, but it personifies the subject matter of the poem, and is used as a metaphor for her mind. The smiles and tints and tell of a day in goodness spent. Those are three examples of personification in the poem. So certainly there's a lot going on. The last stanza, the last set of beauty here. A heart whose love is innocent. Personification. Love or the heart can't be innocent. But in everything that we've looked at, we personify the heart, pure, untainted, delicate, all of those particular images. Very significant. The main theme is the beauty or the woman's appearance, and how we take that concept and we tie it to something more significant. So by focusing solely on her beauty, Byron creates an image of perfect balance. He perfectly balances the dark and the light as both physical images and also the application of how those ideas are going to work out for us in the poem. Seems to totally make sense. By focusing solely on her beauty, Byron creates an image of perfect balance that applies to her inner beauty. Of course, romanticism. We describe something on the outside, then we apply it in the microcosm of the inner self. Certainly a larger idea here. We do know that Byron is objectifying the woman and her beauty. In the 21st century, probably not the coolest thing in the world, this idea of objectification, but it still makes some sense. He judges her on her appearance and leads the reader to believe that the balance makes her perfect without providing any of the details about how he does it. Who she is, what she's interested in, what she's really like. So there's a lot, I think, happening in the poem. This gives you some significant takeaways for this poem by Byron. Now, my plan is not to cover this in class, but to certainly give you the ability to have it in the forefront of your material.